and former Group CEO of global bank HSBC. John has been appointed to the helm of a bank with two main objectives: supporting the UK to reach carbon neutrality and enabling local and regional economic growth. We'll talk to John about the UK Infrastructure Bank's mandate and the speed with which it has already begun investing in new green infrastructure. We'll look at the growing impact of the war in Ukraine and rising commodity prices on the UK's ability to make the green energy transition. And we'll discuss the bank's ongoing work in the context of the unfolding economic and political events in the UK. We're excited to have one of the UK banking sector's most senior figures join us. It will give us a unique insight into the UK's long-term economic objectives and the challenges, and provide an opportunity to explore whether New Zealand should consider a similar approach to funding infrastructure. Welcome, John. It's an absolute pleasure to have you join us here.
No, the pleasure's mine. Thanks very much for having me.
Great. Look, there are so many things for us to talk about, but I thought we should start with the origins of the UK Infrastructure Bank. At a high level, how long has it been discussed, and how was it established, and how would you describe its core mission?
Let's start at the beginning, and obviously the origins of the bank predate my role. I've been here a year, so I joined in September last year, but I think that the bank's origins probably came from two main roots. One was some of the senior figures in the National Infrastructure Commission for quite some years now have been arguing that the UK needed a policy bank that could play a role in accelerating the development of infrastructure, that there were gaps in the private markets that needed to be filled by an organisation like this. And then, of course, the second factor was Brexit, and the fact that post-Brexit, the EIB is no longer deploying capital across the UK, so we lost that development capital being deployed into the UK economy. So a long-standing, if you like, academic argument for the bank, the catalyst of Brexit, and then senior figures in Treasury and the government deciding now is the time to do it. So I think most of the work started a year before I joined, so we're probably two years away from the origins of the bank. That's the background.
Okay, and then it's I guess its core mission is, as you think about it, how would you go about describing that?
Yeah, our mission's clear, compelling, quite narrow, very focused. We are here to ensure that financing required for the infrastructure that will get this country to net zero and help with local and regional economic growth, making sure that finance happens, either by providing it ourselves, but probably more importantly, working with the private sector and crowding in private sector capital, because we've got financial capacity of £22 billion for the first 5 years. In the context of an arm's length public body, that's an awful lot of money. But in the context of the investment required to get to net zero, for example, it's a small amount of money. So we are going to have to play a catalytic role and a convening role in getting the private markets to come alongside us. In my sort of lighter moments, I would describe what we're doing as we're building a government-sponsored niche investment bank in Yorkshire, which I think is a fair description of what we're doing. It hasn't, nothing like that has been done before. But the beauty of our mission is the focus and the clarity around infrastructure. It's only in the UK, and it's all about serving net zero or the broader levelling up agenda.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we're going to go into the detail of that a little bit because it's such an compelling story. But before we do that, it would be great if you could share a little bit about your journey. Where did you start out? How did you find yourself in this role, obviously? And then what attracted you to a civil service position after such an incredible career in banking?
Yeah, so I had a very fortunate, privileged career at HSBC. I joined as graduate trainee. I left as the chief executive. Had some amazing experiences along the way, and then a decision to make. What to do next? What's the next chapter going to bring? And a few people kind of nudged me in the direction of this role when it came up, and it took me a while to figure out that I did want to put my hat in the ring. I think the thing that attracted me in the first instance was just the clarity of the purpose. I think most people want to be purpose-led, and here the purpose just screamed at you from the first words on the page. It was very clear. It was of the moment. Our mission is absolutely timely. You couldn't think of a better time to launch and lead an organisation like this. So that, I guess, drew me in. And then, if I'm really honest, the slightly more selfish reasons kind of came to the fore as well, which were, I recognised that if I took this role on, I would learn an awful lot. I would learn how to do a startup. I joined a medium-sized organisation and ended up leading one of the world's largest organisations. So I'd done the big things. I'd never been anywhere close to a startup before, so I was going to learn how to do that, how to build an organisation from the ground up, how to develop a culture from the ground up, build systems and processes. So I was excited about that. I was also excited at the prospect of learning how government and the public sector works, because I'd always been on the private side and never candidly given it that much thought. And now, this is my new ecosystem. This is where I live and work. So that was a great opportunity. And then the third area of learning that I got excited about was the opportunity to go deep into a sector. Certainly for the last, say, 10 or 15 years of my HSBC career, I was a generalist. I sat across a broad range of things, and you had to be, an expert in 1,000 things at once at a reasonably superficial level. And it's really nice now to get the opportunity to go deep into a sector. So, the clarity of the mission and the purpose, really compelling, drew me in. And then, very selfishly, I got excited about all the great learning opportunities that were in front of me. And a year in, I wasn't wrong. I'm learning an enormous amount. That's great.
Well, it's amazing to hear you so positive about it. I understand when you talked about setting up a bank in Yorkshire, it's established in Leeds, and so you're building a team out of Leeds, which isn't for the UK, perhaps its natural home. Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a really exciting part of the challenge, but it is a challenge because the financial centre of the UK is London. The financial centre of the world is probably still London. We've got other cities that do have a financial presence. As an asset management presence in Edinburgh. Birmingham's got a growing retail presence. Central Leeds actually has a retail banking presence. But we're trying to convene investment banking skills, corporate banking skills, into a city where there isn't a great deal of depth there. So we're doing this in the context of public sector pay and reward as well. So there's nothing wrong with Leeds, but Leeds is a challenge simply because it's not London. And what it means is that the time it takes to scale a team is longer here than it would be if we were scaling it in London. But the reason that it will be worth it is we are going to be part of a growing ecosystem of financial services in the city of Leeds. The Bank of England is relocating hundreds of jobs here. The FCA, the Conduct Authority, have plans to relocate many jobs up here as well. We will probably scale to around 300. So it's a bit of a challenge, but it will be worth it when it's done. 5 years from now, there will be some brilliant jobs in Leeds for people who want to construct a career in finance. And actually what it means for graduates in the north of England, you can build a career in finance now without having to default to living in London. So, it's a bit of a challenge, but it's going to be worth it by the time we've scaled up.
And I'm sure there are a lot of people that like that, and want to get out of the hustle and bustle of the big smoke, and
yes,
and it's actually, but bring their skills to bear.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
How unique is the bank in a Europe world context? How because we don't have one, for example, and I know Australia's got something sort of similar, but it's not set out with the same mandate. How would you describe that?
I think the there's lots of policy banks and development banks, some multilateral, some single country. So it's hard to say that we're unique, but I do think there's nothing else quite as specific to net zero as ours. So Canada has an infrastructure bank with many similar missions, but we're about the infrastructure for net zero and for local and regional economic growth. And I think that makes us unique. So and I think many people in other countries are looking at us, the way that we're setting up, the start that we're having, and they will assess over time whether or not we are able to make that difference in the markets, whether we are able to accelerate the pace at which finance mobilizes around net zero. So many other similar institutions, very few with the narrow, specific kind of niche focus around infrastructure for net zero. And I'd like to think if we can get off to a good start or continue the good start we've made and demonstrate that this does work, that this does make a difference to markets, that we can shape the flows of capital and we can find, that missing risk piece, that missing elusive risk piece that will unlock private flows, that we would hope that other countries might be able to learn from that and do something similar.
It is a global goal, moving to net zero, something we, I guess, most countries, hopefully all countries share. How would you describe the sticking points in the UK to that transition? The stubborn emissions sectors, if you will, and where does the bank think about where it can make the biggest difference in moving them in the right direction?
Yeah, I'm glad we're having this conversation a year in, because a year ago, if we'd done this at the start, I would have been guessing. I've now had a year to kind of understand the landscape, understand government policy. I think the UK is in pretty good shape in the context of the transition to net zero. We've got these much trail statistics. Since 1990, the economy's grown by, get this right, I think the economy's grown by 78%, whilst emissions have fallen by 44%. So we've demonstrated that you can begin the process of decarbonising while still growing the economy. Now, a lot of that was achieved because we took coal out of the power system. So the harder adjustments are ahead. But we do have, I think, a really credible policy framework that indicates government's priorities across the key industrial sectors that are relevant to net zero for the next 5, 10, 15 years. And for us, that's great, because our role is to align behind that and amplify that government policy. So from where I sit at the moment and the organisation I'm trying to build, I like to use the phrase that we have no excuses. It's too easy to say, we need greater clarity around this, we need greater prescription around that. There's enough clarity for us to work with. We know as we plan our capital allocation, we've been given 5 priority sectors of clean energy, digital, waste, water and transport. All fascinating sectors. We'll be active across all of them, but clean energy is by far and away the gorilla sector there. We've got significant capacity of onshore and offshore wind that needs to be financed. We've got solar capacity that needs to be built. We've got an energy storage infrastructure that needs to be built, and we've got the whole hydrogen and carbon capture economies and industries to be built as well. And public policy will start to move that forward, I think, really quite quickly from next year. So we've got a roadmap in front of us which is clear, and so I don't let the team talk about the sticking points. Our challenge is going to be the capital allocation. Where do we use our resources to try and get the biggest leverage?
It's not the strategy, it's the execution.
Absolutely.
You talk about, energy and that being ultimately the key focus area, but your initial investments focused on gigabyte-capable or giga-capable broadband infrastructure. Why was that?
So digital is one of our 5 priority sectors. The role that we played in those, we've done 4 transactions now, was really about accelerating the development of very high-speed broadband capability across the UK. There's a government policy objective that we were supporting, but gigabit or high-speed broadband connectivity is critical to both the levelling up agenda and ultimately to net zero. I mean, the efficiencies that we will require from an integrated energy system will require an awful lot of devices, an awful lot of technology to be connected in a high-speed and intelligent way. So that's, if you like, that's a fundamental piece of infrastructure that will sit underneath nearly everything else we did, everything else that we need to do. And the role that we wanted to play, alongside many other banks actually, was just to accelerate the financing and the market capacity for that build-out. The quicker the build-out happens, the quicker we can get on with the rest of
the good work. Yeah. Okay. So is it about meeting a gap where there's been private sector failure, or is it more about helping the private sector feel more confident in deploying capital through partnerships and guarantees from yourselves?
It can be all of those things. I mean, sometimes you will just have a very clear gap where there could be a risk appetite issue. London is the world's financial capital, but the number of domestic corporate and wholesale banking players is quite small, and sometimes the big players, they go limit up on a particular sector or a particular activity and they're full. And I think as we get into the larger expansion of the clean energy sector, that will happen a little more frequently, and we will on occasion have a role to play where the technology is understood, the risk is understood, there is capacity for it in the market, but it's not enough to meet the scale of the financing required, and we will just slot in and provide capital. That's the very simple end of the problems we need to solve. The more interesting end is when it comes to first-of-a-kind technology, where people will look at a project, and we've got some examples we're looking at now in energy storage, where at one level everybody accepts that we have to build an energy storage industry to support a renewables grid. You can't have the capacity of renewables we have without increased storage capacity. So everyone accepts that. And there are some established technologies that the market is increasingly comfortable financing. But there are some newer technologies that are really interesting that could have a meaningful role to play in long-duration energy storage. But for the first few projects, commercial banks wouldn't normally go there. And in my old role, I probably almost certainly wouldn't have gone there. And that's where we've got a role to play, where we will demonstrate a different appetite for risk and also demonstrate possibly confidence in government policy. We go out looking for problems. To date, we've solved some of the simpler ones, and that's largely just a very humble reflection of the fact we're starting out. We're only a year old, and we haven't scaled the teams and convened all the skills yet. So we've been operating at the simpler end of the problem spectrum. But if there is infrastructure that's needed, it's doable. We can find a way to getting comfortable with the risk and solve a complex problem. We'd rather be at the complex end of the spectrum than the simple end.
You say you had earlier £22 billion of financial capacity, and I understand it's to be deployed over sort of five to 8 years, and you've closed a number of deals, plus hired, I think, 150 people. I kind of laughed when you said we haven't scaled up, having already done that, but very quiet laugh, of course. Tell me about the journey so far to get to that point. I mean, systems and processes are one thing, finding deals is another thing, moving from Excel spreadsheets to hopefully some form of system, is another thing. So how have you thought about that, and how do you know you're going fast enough, or are you going too fast?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, that question is probably the key responsibility for me as the chief exec in these first few years. And a decision was made just before I arrived to launch the bank. We launched the bank, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, launched the bank in June last year. And we declared the bank open. We had some authorities, we had a skeleton staff, and we declared the bank open. And we took a decision, or a decision was taken, which I then kind of entirely embraced when I joined in September, to build the bank by doing, announce that we're open, listen to the market, find a couple of transactions and go and build the bank around that. And in the context of the public sector, that's quite an unusual approach. You know, you look at other arm's length bodies that have been set up, they've typically spent 12, 18 months in the kind of the design stage, you know, writing the policies and the procedures, etc. We took a different approach, and we said we're going to build a bank on the go, and we're going to convene, you know, the skills around the transactions. Looking back at the end of my first year, that was a great decision. It wasn't my decision. I can't take any credit for it, but it was a great decision. Because what I've seen is that the bank's skills and capabilities do shift every time we write a ticket, every time we find a new deal to write, a new structure to finance. The bank's skills build and grow, and you can't do this in theory. You can go so far in theory. You can, and I'm sure you've done this, Stefan, before. You write a policy, and it's not until you try and implement that policy into the market or with a counterparty that you really then understand what it means and where your red lines are. So we've gone at pace, we've gone at real pace, and we've done this as quickly as we reasonably can. And what I say to many of my stakeholders is, I'm going to build this as quickly as we can, whilst being entirely confident that I can manage the risks that we're taking. So we can't be reckless, we're deploying public money. We can't get ahead of our skis. But the mission that we've been set up to serve, net zero and levelling up, is urgent. It's urgent. We can't wait. We can't spend a year writing policies. We can't spend 2 years in design phase. It's urgent. So at the end of the first year, we've now up to 11 transactions. The bank's 160 people. Not enough of them are yet permanent hires. We still are quite dependent on contract staff. But we're going as quickly as we can. And whenever we're challenged, I've got really two messages. One, we think the mission's urgent. If you disagree with us, let me know. And two, I've got a reasonable amount of banking experience. I won't let us get ahead of ourselves. We're taking risks at this stage that we can safely and comfortably manage.
That kind of circles back to your comment earlier about a startup and the mindset of, a willingness to take risk and make mistakes, and also use data to build what you need rather than hypothesize what you'll need in the future. You do it around what you need today, which is perhaps different from how public sector ordinarily operates.
Well, we've got a very clear mandate from Treasury, and we've been set up to be operationally independent, and we have very tight and effective governance with our shareholders. So the potential for us to go off-piste, I think, is pretty limited. And we are deploying public money. So the notion that we can, make mistakes, I think we've got to be pretty careful there. We're deploying money. But the point about the way we've engaged with the market and the benefits of declaring ourselves open and then interfacing with the market is, it's those conversations, it's those dialogues, it's those negotiations that help you figure out actually where the gaps are. And they help you figure out how you can deploy your resources in service of the mission. If you don't, the longer you drag that engagement out, the slower you do that, the slower you're going to be effective. But it comes back to, you've still just got to make sure you're only taking the risk that you can effectively manage, given the state of your development. A couple of years from now, we will have a fully resourced risk function, a fully resourced origination team across the front office, including banking and portfolio management. And at that point, I'd like to think there isn't a structure or a piece of risk that we wouldn't be able to organise ourselves around. Today, there are lots. The 11 transactions we've written, they're quite straightforward, deliberately so, because we're going at pace, but within the constraints, if you like, of the skills and capabilities of the organisation today. And that's my role as the chief exec, or the accounting officer in public sector terms.
Okay. You've announced that the bank is moving into direct equity investments and working with third-party banks. Could you explain what that is, how it works, and why
Yeah.
that's a bit different from the bank's traditional 1-year-old, more debt and guarantee function?
Sure. So if we start with, if you like, the financial risk shape of the bank. So £22 billion is our notional financial capacity. But we have to operate within an economic capital risk budget of £4.5 billion. So nominal of 22, but economic risk of 4.5. Now that indicates that we can't deploy all of our capital into equity, but equally we shouldn't be deploying all of that into senior debt. So we are going to deploy our capital along the capital spectrum, from high-grade senior debt, or I suspect in limited quantums, all the way through to equity. Now, as you will know, direct equity investing is a very different skill set to senior debt lending alongside other banks. As things stand today, as a bank, we've got this team with the skills and experience to do the debt piece. We haven't yet recruited enough people on the direct equity side. So we had a choice, a very clear choice. Do we not commit any capital yet in direct equity? Do we wait? Or do we outsource that activity and deploy it via third-party managers? And we've actually just adopted a technique that has existed in government before, of using qualified third-party managers to deploy some of our capital on our behalf. We've done that to a limited extent in our first year. That will wind down as we build the skills. But the key decision for us was, if you don't have the skills to do this yourself today, do you wait until you do? Or do you take advantage of the fact that we are in the UK and we do have this amazing financial ecosystem and people with great skills and an urgent mission? Do you use them? We've taken the decision, with the full support of the board and the shareholder, that we will use third-party managers to a limited extent. And we've done a bit of that in the first year. So it's pretty straightforward, I hope reasonably uncontroversial. We are building the skills, we're doing the recruitment now to be able to do it ourselves.
But it also means that you accelerate the deployment of the capital, doesn't it?
Exactly. It means you accelerate the deployment of the capital, but the other thing that we're learning from already is that your coverage and your breadth of market insight expands very quickly, because you get to see the investee companies in these portfolios. We didn't have the skills to go out and source the transactions, but we are now the beneficiary of the quarterly reports that tell us how these portfolios are doing. There will be follow-on investments required. It will give us direct insights into the capital flows across niche parts of our sector mandate. So it just accelerates things. And the real, what do we come back to? That first principle is, this mission's urgent. Anyone who thinks we should be waiting or be patient, I'm happy to have that conversation, but we'll end up disagreeing with it.
Well, I like that you're clearly so clear about that. There's a good chance the UK is in for something of a rough winter this year, and Europe as a whole, with energy prices and going up meaningfully, and the potential for a slowdown. Is financial instability likely to change or impact what you do, or if that is the knock-on effect of it, or is it more that the bank is more immune because of its long-term goal and the fact that it's who its stakeholders are?
I'd like to think the bank's mission is immune, but there's no question that the markets we're leaning into are absolutely affected by rising rates, by inflationary pressures. A lot of infrastructure has huge energy price inputs into the raw materials: steel, concrete, cables, etc. So there's no question that the markets that we're serving are impacted by what's going on now. But if you, again, take a step back, that probably means we're going to be more needed than less needed. There are going to be more gaps than there would be otherwise. There are going to be more projects that struggle to either get off the ground or struggle to continue. So I think the need for us just really intensify, and it's I don't take any pleasure in this, but the need for us and the organisation that we're building intensifies as financial market conditions deteriorate. And I have this conversation with the team nearly every day. It's hard not to be distracted by everything that's going on around us, right? I mean, everyone's human, and there's an awful lot going on inside the UK and then outside the UK as well. It's hard not to get distracted, but what we consciously try to do is just remind everybody why we're here, what our mission and purpose is, and how important it is, how increasingly important it is that we just build the skills so we can deliver what we've got as quickly as possible, because it's going to be needed.
Yes, it is. So much of Europe has turned away from nuclear energy after Fukushima, and we're seeing places like Germany turning to coal now, arguably as a result of that. What's the UK's nuclear energy policy, and how do you think about it in terms of deploying capital to achieving your net zero goals?
Yeah, so nuclear is part of the energy policy for the UK going forward. That's been clear for a while now. Significant investment and expansion into our nuclear capacity, and that actually, from an engineering perspective, I think makes perfect sense in the context of the stability that's going to be required as we pivot to a mostly renewable grid. Now, because it's government policy, as a policy bank, it's not really our role to second guess that. So we will have a financial capacity for nuclear, but it's too early at this stage to know how we will be required and how much of our capacity might be required. So yeah, I mean, nuclear is part of the go forward here in the UK, and if we can play a constructive role, if there are market gaps when it comes to financing the new projects, we will be there.
I suspect it's a very specialist skill set. That when you're looking at those sorts of projects, how do you assess the viability? How do you there's a very long lead-in time to from concept to a shovel going in the ground to actually producing something.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And I do have a couple of colleagues in the bank who have worked on nuclear programs before and for many years. As you say, the duration attached to them is long. But I think the key thing is getting that mix right between direct public investment in the equity piece, and then understanding the market's capacity for taking the rest. And of course, we have the RAB model here, the regulated asset base, which provides for quite a helpful financing mechanism to de-risk both the construction and the operation phase. So it'll get done. No question of that. Just what that ultimate financing menu looks like, I think, is to be determined.
A smorgasbord, perhaps.
Indeed.
As we were preparing, you talked about a conundrum, in that at some point in the future, where energy generation becomes so much cheaper everywhere at the same time, and because of the net, as a result of the net zero goal, and that this creates real challenges for organisations, banks, modelling, how they think about their projects that they're looking at. And I presumably HM Treasury thinks and understands, this conundrum at some level too. How do you see that playing out? And is it a real risk today, or is it something that we sort of ignore and press on?
Well, I think we need to ignore it and press on. is the first answer. But I do think it's sometimes helpful to kind of try and get the crystal ball out and think 15, 20 years hence. And I do this in the spirit now of trying to be optimistic about the future. And it's not been easy to be optimistic about the future for a little while. I've spent a reasonable amount of time in the Nordics in the last few months, which has been fascinating. And it made me realise that I think the rational plan, if you are a democratic government, is to plan towards energy self-sufficiency, mostly powered by renewables, and to plan to have a bit more than you actually need. That's what we intend to do in the UK, and that's what the Nordics intend to do, and that's what I suspect most European countries will intend to do, which is great. I mean, it's that in the context of your domestic mandate makes perfect sense. You want a bit more than a bit less. You don't really ever want to be in deficit, because that's what was causing the strain now. Now, the renewable capacity available through wind, through solar, etc., is more than enough. So this is all completely doable if we get the investment right. So it doesn't take too many leaps of faith to think 15, 20 years from now, electricity is going to be very cheap. Very cheap. And I don't regard, yes, there'll be a risk to returns at some point in the future. I don't regard that as a problem. I think that's one of the biggest opportunities we've got, because when I look at the global transition to net zero, I think direct air capture of carbon from the atmosphere is going to be a critical part in keeping us remotely close to 1.5 degrees, because there are so many other frictions and difficulties involved in decarbonising the rest of the processes. So 15 to 20 years from now, I think it'd be great. If there are surplus electrons, we should be using them to drive the capture of CO2 from the atmosphere. At the moment, that technology and that process is extraordinarily expensive, but those cost curves will come down. And it's just a thought I like to leave people with, because it's hard to find too many reasons for optimism. Cheap energy 15 to 20 years from now across the democratic world will provide the biggest productivity boost to economies that we've probably seen in my lifetime, but it will also provide this opportunity to solve one of the grittier parts of the carbon challenge, which is to pay for extracting it from the atmosphere.
You recently invested alongside the European Investment Bank in NewConnect, an undersea energy link between Germany and the UK, which I obviously don't know a lot about, but that suggests both countries are wanting to export energy between them, and so presumably if the UK will be exporting to Germany in the first instance, I imagine, but maybe I'm mistaken there. So I guess that's an example of where the bank is putting in place infrastructure to facilitate, that longer term goal.
Yeah, I mean, the NewConnect deal is a really nice transaction. A different piece of technology. The EIB were the cornerstone on the euro leg. We were the cornerstone on the sterling leg, and this is two democracies connecting their renewable grid to each other. And I genuinely expect energy to flow both ways, because if it's the simple theory goes that if it's windy in Germany and not so windy in the UK, then it'll flow this way and vice versa. But as Europe, well, all countries in the vicinity of the UK develop their renewable capacity, it makes perfect sense for these interconnectors to be in place because of the intermittency of the renewable flows. And it also just increases stability and resilience across the grids. Clearly, there are some vulnerabilities to these undersea cables, and we've got this awful experience this week of a couple of the pipelines going through the Baltic. It looks like they've been sabotaged, and it shows you, that if you become dependent on a piece of physical infrastructure, that bad actors can damage that. But that doesn't, that's a risk factor. It doesn't undermine the economic case for connecting up the renewable grids across countries that you can depend on.
And working with the European Investment Bank, is that something you expect to do more of with other banks?
Absolutely. I mean, I frequently tell people we have no competitors. We have no competitors. The spirit of this organisation is to be there to solve problems. If by cooperating, partnering, risk sharing with another multilateral bank or development bank or private sector actor, we'll do it. If we walk into a room and find that somebody else is happy to finance a piece of infrastructure that we like, we'll shake their hands and move on because we're not needed. But yeah, I mean, completely open mind to who we can cooperate with. We've just got to make sure that every time we deploy capital, we're solving a problem that needs to be solved. The EIB is a wonderful organisation, long established, a massive balance sheet. They probably don't know it yet. We've already learned a lot from them.
Well, they can listen to the podcast and find out.
Well, they should be flattered to know that we've learned an enormous amount from them. But yeah, we have no competitors, so we will compete with anybody and everybody.
Okay, and in your strategic plan, you talk about crowding in investment. I've never actually heard the term crowding in. What do you mean by that? I know what crowding out means, but presumably it's the inverse of that. But why did you choose why were those words chosen?
It's a good question. I don't know where the words come from, but you're absolutely right. It's the inverse of crowding out. So it's the spirit of, if we're there, that encourages other people to be alongside us. And in nearly every transaction to date, there's evidence that that's the case. People have said, yeah, well, if you're in, we're in. Or if you're in, I can get my credit committee to approve a larger amount. Because the market rightly sees that we are deploying public money. And we have one shareholder, which is HM Treasury. So that gives, our participation in transactions gives the market a level of confidence that I think is important.
And you talk in one place around different types of investments that have potential, and I guess at the next phase, your strategic reporter sort of looks forward from a point in time. And that point in time, the things I noted were electric vehicle charging points, retrofitting buildings, scaling up of storage technologies, and carbon capture and other forms of carbon storage. In that sort of group, are there areas that you think are going to be focused on today or in the near future, and then as you've done with internet, and then you'll move over to another type like energy generation? Or
if you look at the menu of potential areas for us to get involved in it is large. In terms of the big industrial sectors that are going to be built, storage, we're starting to get active in that, and you'll see us deploy capital over the next 12 months. Hydrogen and carbon capture, that's probably a second half of 2023 onwards period. But then underneath that, there are certain infrastructure challenges that are common to many local authorities in the United Kingdom, where we've probably got a meaningful role that we can play in helping them solve those challenges. So, for example, EV charging. You won't be able to buy a new petrol or diesel car from the year 2030 here. So the acceleration to EV road vehicles is happening now. The EV charging infrastructure isn't really in place yet. So that's got to be built, both public and private. And we have a particular local authority business which focuses on both financing and advising local authorities as they solve some of these problems. So that's something that we should be thinking about and working on every day for the foreseeable future until that problem's solved. Similarly, with energy efficiency in buildings, we call the retrofit challenge, either domestic or commercial. That's an urgent issue now, and we need to be making progress on that today. And that's been quite a frustrating challenge for the UK. The UK's had a number of initiatives around this that probably haven't had the traction that people wanted. And we've got a role to play there as well. I think certainly for the next year or so, piloting new approaches to this, but trying to accelerate the rate at which we achieve high levels of energy efficiency. We've got a lot of leaky buildings in the UK at the moment, and a lot of the energy that we use is wasted, and that's not acceptable. So there are certain themes like that will be part of our daily life for the foreseeable future, and then when it comes to some of the bigger industrial expansions, we align behind government public policy. So the calendar for public policy, if you like, dictates the pace. Okay,
so it sounds like there's a lot of kind of simultaneous work taking place, and one of the things we think a lot about at NZ Funds is commodities, and the fact that a lot of countries and organisations are trying to make the same energy transition at the same time. And how how do commodity prices and rising commodity prices we're currently seeing, but how do they factor in your modelling, and if at all, and where do you sort of see I guess, you know, a lot of people out there are saying there's a super cycle starting, if you will, in this transition space, and, you know, does that feature in how your team and you think about your investments?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a key cost or price input into many of the projects that we will look to get involved with. Markets at the moment are a bit difficult. The markets are confused by the prospect of a looming global recession based on inflation, based on rates. But at the same time, the commodity supercycle driven by this consistent switch to a different energy system is real. There's no question. The issue that sits underneath that, I think, really is about the supply chain, and the investment theme that I think will dominate for the next decade at least is untangling supply chains between autocracies and democracies. It's already, it's starting, but it's got a lot further to go. Too many vivid examples as we speak of the dangers of being dependent upon an autocracy, and it's this issue of rule of man versus rule of law. If you negotiate with another democracy, you're negotiating with ultimately institutions that represent the people, and people ultimately got the power to get rid of leaders if they start to make irrational decisions. Autocracies do not work that way, and they cannot be relied on in the same way. So from an investment perspective, the commodity supercycle issue is real, and from an investment thesis perspective, untangling supply chains between autocracies and democracies, that we're at the start of a 10-year cycle on that, which is going to be profound for capital flows, investment flows. I'm not sure aware enough of how difficult that's going to be, because some of the minerals that we require, some of the commodities that we require, are inconveniently in the wrong places.
It is. How would you describe then your relationship with, I guess, as an organisation with Treasury, and the role of, I guess, the steer that the government gives you in deploying capital, and has that changed through time? Have you, obviously with the Ukraine happening and there's Brexit, of course, how has government influenced your thinking?
Yeah, so I'm a year into life in the public sector, so I would say I'm still learning it, but it's been a really good experience. So Treasury set us up with a very clear mandate. We've got very clear, well-documented, well-thought-out agreements that govern how we work. We've been established to be operationally independent, and that's really important, I think, for everyone to remember. Our authority and our resources come from Treasury, but the decisions we make as an executive and as a board. We have a board that's independent from Treasury, and that means, crucially, that ministers can't be held accountable for the decisions that I make as the chief executive, because I have to turn down transactions regularly, and I have to make decisions to deploy public money. I do that with the authority that I've got from Treasury, but the ministers are not responsible for the decisions that I make. So that we've been set up in a very, very clear way. And actually, it's nice to have just one shareholder. That's a new experience for me. And today, they've been a terrific shareholder. So that relationship works well. They have the ability to approve. They do approve our strategy every year. We refresh it. And in between times, they have a mechanism called a strategic steer, where the Chancellor would write to me with just that, a strategic steer. And the former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, wrote to me, I think it was in April, with the strategic steer, which was really about energy security and the role of natural capital in the net zero transition. So there are two main points in it. The first point was really in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the need for energy security, domestic energy security, to progress up the agenda, which is very easy for us to assimilate, because clearly it just meant that everything we were doing just accelerated a little bit. So that mechanism was used for energy security. And then a reminder, I think a really helpful reminder, that we need to start thinking about the role that nature or natural capital can play in the transition to net zero. Frankly, we've got more work to do in that area before we're clear. But yeah, so very clear relationship with Treasury. They've been a brilliant shareholder today. And then there is this mechanism for the Chancellor to write with a strategic steer, entirely appropriate, because all of the money we deploy is public money.
And are you allowed to surface those things within your organisation, or more broadly? Obviously you have now, but how do you use that? Because it would shape how you think about investing. It would probably motivate, I'm guessing, your staff and thinking, wow, there's real poignance, if you will, in what we're doing and what's relevant to the government at large today. How do you use those documents?
Yeah, and there's nothing secret about them. I mean, one of the things I've learned about life in the public sector is that everything's very, very transparent. So these are public documents, and it's clear to everyone to see that. Now, you use it as if you're the chief executive, accountable to a board and ultimately to a shareholder. If the people that control your resource or own your capital say that we want you to pay more attention to this, pay more attention to it. And the context of that strategic steer is very straightforward, because did it change what we were doing? It intensified, focused our minds. It intensified the debates we were having. It didn't change the direction at all, because one, we were only 6 or 7 months old and we got it. But two, it wasn't a change of direction, right? If anything, it was just really intensifying what we were already doing. Exactly.
Okay, fantastic. All right, last question from me. Any hot tips for someone setting up an infrastructure bank in the Southern Hemisphere that you want to share?
I've got the benefit of a whole year's experience here, so I'm not sure I've got too many tips. I do think, say, the decision that was taken to not spend too much time designing this, get to the point where you know what you're doing, give the organisation some resources, make sure you've got people that have got some skills and qualifications that you trust, and just tell them to get going. Because you'll learn more by doing than you ever will by kind of doing this in theory. Make sure the governance processes around it are tight so that you can't really go off-piste. But yeah, I think the key thing, if you are deploying public money into infrastructure in pursuit of net zero or local and regional economic growth, wake up every day recognising it's urgent and you've got to get on with it. It's easy with infrastructure to say every project takes 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, and therefore today's not urgent. It is. It really is urgent today. This is in service of a climate crisis. The UK is only 1% of global emissions. So you can take a view, and in my role, you could take a view that says, well, even if we saw the same for the UK, we're not going to solve the global crisis. That's the wrong way to think about it. This country, in my view, gave the world the last industrial revolution. We've got a bit of a moral responsibility to try and help the world with the next one. The technologies and the skills that we'll develop, both at an industrial and engineering, scientific, and at a financing level in the UK, we should be able to use everything we've got to hone those, deploy those well, and export them. Not export in the commercial sense, but let other people see how it can be done. Avoid the mistakes that we make along the way, take the shortcuts, and accelerate their transition. So, yeah, this country's only 1% of emissions, but we can be a much more significant part of the solution. It's urgent. So if New Zealand does contemplate something like this, we'd be very happy to share everything that we've learned. But if you're thinking about it, get on with it, would be my view.
That's fantastic. And I love the role modelling aspect to it. You have important work to get onto. So with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for your time, John. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, and I wish you the best for the next wee while.
Stefan, thank you so much. It's been a privilege to be invited to do